Welcome to a special Chinese New Year edition of the PI Podcast, political investigations for the palaging inis and the perpetually irate. I'm your host, Matt, and with me is my co-host, 他是书上的找打，他是一边老人，他是我的朋友。
老人 What the hell?
这个Borge.
Hey, I got that one. PI nyo, PI nating lahat. Board here at your service. Kala mo.
Well, clearly we both speak a bit of Mandarin, so yeah. But I'm just sticking with the occasion, you know. And of course, we're recording this on the eve of Chinese New Year.
恭喜发财, which is
恭喜发财.
What does it mean again?
It's Cantonese.
No, 恭喜
Happy
发
New
财.
Year.
No, 恭喜发财 is Cantonese, I think.
恭喜发.
恭喜发财 is, I don't know. Is it
There's
Mandarin?
hardly any difference, really.
No, there's
Mandarin is 今年快乐. 今年快乐 is
yeah.
much simpler.
Yeah, Jinyan Kuala. Yeah, okay, yeah.
I mean,
Christ.
see, it's quite complicated. You know, China is such a complicated culture. It's very difficult, in fact. And today is a special episode. We waited a bit longer, and sorry for the delay because we are both in our finals week. You know, finishing up grades of our students. So yeah.
How's checking papers?
Oh my God, it's both rewarding and at the same time soul taxing, you know, soul draining. But you know, you win some. Well, it's a mix of good and bad, you know. But you take the good, you know. At least people learn from you. And for those, those who aren't as good, well, they're not your problem anymore. So, but yeah,
in a nutshell,
teaching is a mixed bag. Yeah.
In a
How
nutshell,
about you?
bad papers can reduce our lifespan.
Oh my God. Some can outright kill you. And I bet you've killed a few with your own.
Checking, it's the first time I've checked and graded papers for 5 years, I think. It's the first time after 5 years. So that's...
For me, it's 4 years. So yeah.
Welcome change of pace.
But this time we are back and talking about, like, again, a special holiday, but something we know a bit intimately. And we're talking about China.
Yep.
How do you say China? 中国.
中国.
中国. Yeah. 对不起，我们的中文不好. So yeah, it's our meager attempt at Chinese, but you know, it's our way of trying to understand. So tell me, since both of us are actually students of Shanghai Jiao Tong University, woo, 交大,
Woo, 交大,
加油, 交大. We actually have a bit of insight because we've stayed for about like 3 to 4 years. For you, it's like 4 years. For me, it's 3 years. Yeah. So what can you say about, about China itself? You know, we have a tense relationship with, our Philippines and China. But what can you say about China being there for 4 or 5 years?
Okay, life in China. Well, again, we lived in Shanghai, which is cosmopolitan city. It's not so much Chinese, but it is China. It is the cosmopolitan side of China. It is the modern, not really progressive, but I think it's more foreigner-friendly place. They just left us alone, really, in Shanghai at the very least. But one thing about, since we're discussing our complicated relationship with China, one experience that I can share, just to start with, would be the marriage market. And the People's Park.
Basically Tinder, but in real life.
Tinder, but
and
your
instead of
mother
you playing, your parents are playing or are swiping for you. So it's funny, yeah.
That's basically that.
And we go on.
So wait, have you been there? Yeah, you've been there, right?
A few times, yeah.
Yeah, it's very entertaining. I remembered one time I went there, so just roaming around, and one of the parents asked, Nishi Fei Yubin Renma. So
Fei Yubin Renma.
Yeah, Fei Yubin Renma. They were
asking, are you Filipino?
Yeah. And I said, yeah, shoulda. And then they said, no. So I got rejected by parents.
不要.
I've been collecting rejections all my life, and that is the most amusing.
Oh my God. It's in another language. So not only are you rejected here, but you're rejected in mainland China.
and someone else's parent.
Oh yeah, someone else's parent. Oh yeah, but it's funny. It's a weird thing because they ask questions not nothing to do with love, but more like how much is your salary or like what's your job, like how many houses or cars do you have? So it's a very like financial transaction. It's quite fascinating.
Or you're a Shanghai resident.
Are you a Shanghai resident? So
Huko,
we have
huko.
a Shanghai hukou. Yeah, a hukou is like a internal passport in the
Yeah.
mainland China. If you're a city person, you need a hukou. If you want to go from the countryside or from the rural area, if you're from the province, a lot of people from the province here just go in and out, plain and simple. But here you need a document, just a hukou. So
Yep.
it's really fascinating. So yeah, but what about the relationship? There's already like a spicy interaction there. Like there's subtext. Like they know you're Filipino, and they they reject you right out. It has nothing to do with your looks, or your job, or your quirks or personality, but really just the fact you're Filipino.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, you think that has something to do with like our international relations,
I
or
think
do they
that
know? Like, what is the reputation of Filipinos in mainland China by your impression?
I think for those who are exposed to more foreigners, I don't think they care. If they're exposed to
Mm,
foreigners, I don't think they care.
right.
But again, the more ordinary Chinese, again, they get their information from the news. And as far as Chinese
Mhm.
news are concerned, what is the Philippines? The Philippines is first and foremost a supplier of bananas. Second, we
Oh
are a
yeah.
beach destination. So
Hmm.
those are the top two things I think whenever they hear the word Filipino or whenever they talk about the Philippines, they would talk about bananas and beach.
So we're literally a banana republic to them. But
So yeah.
I can confirm because in case you and I were homesick, we'd
Mm.
just go to the local fruit store and
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
from bananas from Davao
yeah,
and we say Dole.
yeah.
So yeah, it's fascinating. And ours is the best apparently. Well,
Yep.
with a close second, the Thai bananas, and of course, like we also supply them with durians, which is funny. It's
Mm.
a weird exotic fruits. But
Yeah,
yeah, and I think another thing that kind of was a source of contention years back before the pandemic was them coming here a lot, and
mm,
a huge wave of tourism, like not just the Philippines but everywhere else. When
mm,
they come here, they would be known to I don't know, to leave their trash around. They'd be rude. They'd be
mm.
shouting and all that.
Yeah,
And that's somewhat affected our perception of them, because
yeah,
a lot of these tourists are actually the new middle class. They
yeah,
have all this spare income, and
yeah,
now they have all this money, and so what they do to spend is they go not just to the Philippines, but we go to Thailand, Vietnam, and
yeah,
even sometimes to Europe. And
yep.
this has made a common trend of like Chinese people like making the news.
Mm.
You know,
Chinese
Eh,
tourists.
oh yeah, Chinese tourists. But at the heart of it, I think, perhaps, and this is the main question for today's podcast, which is like, why
Mm.
do we have a dysfunctional relationship with China? And so we're going to talk about that for today. So yeah, let's start it. Starting with, I mean, we talked about these
Mm.
impressions, but do you think that we're in a way connected with China besides, of course, today's politics and globalization?
Okay.
Because yeah, go ahead.
Regarding that one, I think China right now is serving the purpose of being the great other for many
Hmm.
societies, including the Philippines. For many
Hmm.
societies, our problem is that they're not totally the great other because they have been part of our history for a long time. So that's a
Mm.
difference. It's a difference. So, and I think that that is a trait that we share with our Southeast Asian neighbors because China
Hmm.
is also part of their histories. So yes, even if they're the great other, they're not totally separate from us, and I think
Right.
that's a key point we can start with. So, what are our
Right.
ties with China? China's
Hmm.
well, the thing is, if we talk about China, we must separate. Again, I think I'm doing a favor to our Filipino Chinese friends.
You're
We
right.
must separate first Filipino Chinese and mainland Chinese. We must make that
Right.
distinction, and then we must make a
Hmm.
distinction between interacting with Chinese culture and with the Chinese government, with Beijing. So those are two different issues that we can tackle.
Hmm.
and also looking at interacting with different types of Chinese. I
Oh,
mean, our
different
interaction,
types.
different types. I mean,
There are types of Chinese. Oh my god.
yeah, okay, fine, fine. It may be racist to say that they look alike, but
um, but
I,
they're fundamentally different. Yeah, is that what you're
uh,
saying?
it's not. It's not okay. I think I can focus more on their orientation and their exposure to foreigners. So that's one thing.
Orientation. That's
Or
private. That's personal.
no
What do you mean
focus,
orientation?
or not really orientation. Okay, exposure to
Mm-hmm.
foreigners. I think the
Uh-huh.
Chinese who are more exposed to foreigners, they're the ones who are friendlier. That's one thing. They're more
Mm-hmm.
cosmopolitan, but those who are not, and
Mm.
they're the ones that I think we find utterly rude or dysfunctional
Mm-hmm.
when they enter in our societies. So,
Right.
but that's
And
one thing.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think one last thing: the Chinese, they play this role of being the great other because they bring their culture with them. They bring their
Mhm.
habits and their practices wherever they go, even if they're tourists.
Mm.
That's why they only
Oh,
go to
that's
Chinese restaurants.
yeah, yeah, that's funny. And I think just to add to your point on, on us being connected. Yeah. In fact, the first time I went to China,
Mm.
in Shanghai years ago,
Yeah.
2016, I just noticed that when I was in the train, not only did it smell of like noodles, like literally smelled like noodles, but also like the people around you. They kind like you'd almost find a slightly more Chinese version of people you know. Like I saw three people look like my own father, my dad. I saw three more people who looked like our seniors from De La Salle. I won't say which. I've seen like Chinese version of our friends, and I've also seen like, and if you've been to other countries, you'd see that there's again like Cambodians, Vietnamese, Thai. I mean, it's not racist. Like it's somewhat. I don't want to say it's racist, but you see like the similarities
Mm,
of the common Oriental features.
mm,
There's this old adage that almost everyone is in the world, at least in the Eastern Hemisphere, is descended from Genghis Khan. But in the middle between Genghis Khan and today, perhaps the middle is like China. And on your point on the different kinds of China, different orientations. Funny thing is that there is actually somewhat of a, if you notice, there's a bit of a hierarchy
mm,
depending on what kind of like Chinese you speak. There used to be this thing where
mm,
Hokkien used to be like the older, rich Chinese.
mm,
Hokkien. If you notice, like, and the Cantonese
mm,
are more of like either the, I don't know, Southwest Chinese or the Hong Kong Chinese, which
mm.
are well, of course, originated from Pancit Canton, quote unquote. I'll double check on that. And number two, also, I think they're a bit of like the, well, more financially affluent
Mm.
Chinese, and they speak Cantonese. Um, and I think Hokkien, going back to that, come to think of it, I don't know if you know this, but there are a lot of like last names that are Hokkien, if I'm not mistaken. I'll double check that. In fact, things like Season, Dizon. I think my mother's maiden name is Dizon, and Dizon is
Mm.
actually a Hokkien name, or is it Fukien? Oh, I think it's Fukien. See, it's there's so many times. Yeah, well, we'll double check on that, but it's yeah, it means second son, I think. So even in these, how you say, cultural markers like our last names and genetic similarities, you could find our connection to China. But the thing
Mm.
is, similar to like perhaps being embarrassed by sometimes our parents in our adolescence, trying to establish our own identity, and especially when they're being overbearing, I think that's where the tension lies. I mean, a lot of our ancestors, whether we like it or not, are actually more or less Chinese. Don't you
Well,
have
well,
Chinese lineage?
I do have Chinese lineage. That's one thing.
Mm-hmm.
But
Right.
regarding that one, okay, just a clarification again. Well, genetics. That's way beyond the scope of our of our
Right.
podcast. But I think we
Right.
can discuss more or less cultural and historical relations which had been going on, and this I think is driven by trade. So that's one thing that
Mm-hmm.
marks
Of course.
China
Mark.
as distinct, and something that places the Chinese closer to the European Jews because their connection
Ooh.
is primarily economic.
Right. In fact, if you look at the history books, like there's always like a bunch of Chinese merchants and fishermen who or like a fixture in the
Mm.
ports. See, that's where they mostly thrive. You
Mm.
know, they sell their wares during the ports,
Mm.
and sometimes in the capital, especially even in Imperial Manila. You know, they're
Mm.
actually, in fact, the first Chinatown was an imperial ghetto where
Mm.
the Spanish, who were our imperial, how you say, well, our imperial authorities, they
Mm.
would always put the Chinese into this ghetto, which is known today as Binondo, if am I right?
Yeah.
And I think it was you who told me this years ago, but they would routinely shoot cannonballs into Binondo just because, just to
Too many
torture them.
Chinese. This is too many
Too many
Chinese.
Chinese. But the funny thing about Binondo is that eventually, even in the imperial times, it became known as the financial center of Imperial Manila. Event, yes, a lot of banks were located there. So take that. Uh, I mean, no matter how much you suppress them, they always find a way to find money and get rich. Hence, crazy rich Asians. So yeah, that's a broad stroke, but yeah. What do you think about this? How you say, historic connection? It's deeply rooted in our veins, whether you like it or not. I mean,
Mm.
to this day, I mean, we still have cultural markers like Chinese restaurants, shopao, shomai, pancit canton, and especially right now the holiday, which is cuisine of tikoy. What do you call that?
That's one thing.
Chowking, North Park. Yeah,
Regarding Shopao, I have been in Shanghai for four
right.
years. I never ate a single Shopao there.
Mm.
Nakakahanap ka ba ng
But
Shopao doon? may shop,
no,
may,
oh, no, I don't think so. No,
wala
it's
Shopao
called
sa Shanghai.
Bowser, isn't it? Is it?
Bauza,
Isn't it?
Bauza is a different one. It's a
Mm,
different one. It's a meat sandwich between two Shopao like bread. But it's not Shopao
well,
like.
I think it's a regional variant.
Eh,
Mostly in mainland China, it's more commonly known as Bowser. But I think the one that came to the Philippines is from, I think, again, like most things, it's from the Xi'an province. So yeah, if you
may
know,
lumpiang Shanghai ba sa Shanghai? Have you nakain
wala
ka ba?
eh.
Nakain ka
You
ba
know
ng
naman sa
lumpia?
alam ko marami kang nakain na lumpia, di ba? Natikman
Gago.
na lumpia.
Oh my God.
And, oh my god. Okay, that's a different thing.
Walang lumpia
Excuse
doon,
you.
gago.
Yeah, technically the spring roll that we're talking
Hmm.
about that we know in the Philippines is actually not from Shanghai. It's actually just a name given to it eventually, by the people selling it, just to add, how you say, just to add exoticism, I suppose.
Yeah, I
Just
think
to add
so.
a brand. It's branding basically, Shanghai. Shanghai rolls, lumpiang Shanghai. So yeah,
Hmm.
it's a lie. Lumpiang Shanghai is a lie.
Walang
So
lumpia
yeah,
sa Shanghai.
walang lumpia sa Shanghai. So yeah, it's definitely spring rolls. But yeah, it's actually kind of weird. So yeah, you were saying about that, the food there. Yeah,
But yeah,
suddenly a
that's one thing.
travel vlog or travel podcast.
Walang
Yeah,
lumpia sa Shanghai.
yeah. Anyway, back to politics.
Okay, back to politics. Now, regarding China's emphasis on trade and economics, I think this is crucial to understanding China right now and what China
Mm,
was as an empire, and
right.
what China is right now as a superpower, which is again they're focusing on economics. Again, their policy is not to interfere in someone else's politics.
Hmm.
All they're doing is to trade, extract resources. They would interfere in politics if and only if it more or less bothers their economic ties. So that's one thing.
Is is that what it's called, like Tianxia, which is like under heaven? Well, in Chinese,
All
under
under,
heaven,
all under heaven. Tianxia.
which is basically an old tributary system wherein they don't really how you say govern directly in the local
Mm,
authorities. As long as they give tribute, then everything's all right.
mm,
So I think that's the new hegemonic concept that they are
mm.
like reinvigorating today's
I think
politics. Yeah.
that well, this historically speaking, I think that separates Chinese or Asiatic imperialism. Let's just say Chinese, because the
Right.
Indian subcontinent would have its own system. But I think that would
Right.
separate that from the Roman imperialist schema, because the Roman Empire
Hmm.
is extractive. It sought to integrate all provinces into itself.
Hmm.
While in China, well, it expanded, but it's a bit more loose as an empire.
Hmm.
It's economically driven, and the imperial system in China is different. In the imperial
Right.
system in China, what you do
Huh.
is, yeah, as you said, the tributary system, which for our listeners,
Right.
just a background for the tributary system. You pay
Mm-hmm.
tribute to Beijing or to the emperor, no, not to
Mm-hmm.
Beijing, okay, to the emperor. You pay tribute to the
Right.
emperor so that you can conduct trade. So
Mm-hmm.
that's if your tribute gets rejected, then that means you're fucked. You cannot trade with the Chinese. But if your tribute
Mm.
is accepted, then that is the start of trade relations.
Uh-huh.
That's one thing.
Mm. See, that's funny. The I mean, it's a very hands-off approach, like what you said, of
Mm,
governance and empire. Like they don't really impose their laws but what they particularly offer,
mm,
is really trade. A lot of things that cannot really be found anywhere
mm,
else,
mm,
but in these days, it can be found literally everywhere.
mm,
Like how there's used to be like this they used to have like command or monopoly of
mm,
certain things like paper,
mm,
uh, fireworks, literally the old expression "fine china," the
mm,
porcelain dishes.
mm.
Now that's easily pirated and like would say bootlegged.
Yeah,
But
basically the
back in the
Europeans bootlegged
day,
it.
oh exactly. But back in the day, yeah, they offered so many like precious products, and
Mm,
I think that's what made that's primarily the engine of like their global power, global
mm,
influence, basically trade,
yeah.
and of course the speciality of their culture, and eventually
Mm,
and established Chinatowns everywhere.
mm,
They put down their roots and they managed to produce it here in their country. Like we know that you can find all the best Chinese food
mm,
in Chinatowns, everywhere, whether it be in
yeah.
Los Angeles, San Francisco,
Yeah.
London. There's always that. So that's partly the how they embed in the world or global consciousness.
Mm.
Yeah.
But again, they embed. Yeah, they do embed. They try to be a part of a society, but they are still, and I think this is deliberate. They're
Mm-hmm.
deliberately a sore thumb. So
Mm-hmm.
they don't integrate and mix. They integrate as basically a distinct feature in a certain society. That's why you have Chinatown.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they're concentrated in a certain place. And I
Mm-hmm.
think this is deliberate. They want to bring China wherever they go. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
They want to bring their habits, their practices, their social networks
Mm-hmm.
wherever they go. That's why they have Chinatowns. And by the way,
Right.
just a clarification. The notion of China is a modern invention. Something that we need to
Mm-hmm.
clarify for our listeners. It's a modern invention. Zhongguo, the Middle
Is the middle.
Kingdom.
Yeah.
It's supposedly it's supposed to tie the ancient with the modern, but it's a modern
Mm-hmm.
invention. China was never
Right.
called China.
Mm-hmm.
China was called, or that place was called, whatever the dynasty is
Mm.
ruling.
So it's
So
the Shin Dynasty,
the
the
Qing, the
the Qing,
Daming, Da
the
Qing.
Daming.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so Qin, they want to trace China back to that. That's why they invented the common notion of a Zhongguo
Mm-hmm.
of China.
Right.
But yeah, it's a
Mm-hmm.
modern invention.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Speaking of like, well, bringing China wherever they
Mm,
go, they also kind of you're right in saying that they restrict access to it, and unless you want access to it, you need to either pay up or
mm.
sometimes eventually, well, also prove yourself to be Chinese. Like this common, well, I think this common popular culture term, the Great Wall. Like if ever may crush kang chinita o chinito, di ba?
The
Kailangan
Great
mo
Wall
maging
Chin.
chick. Yeah, the Great Wall. You have to be Chinese also, It's like, like I have an ancestor who was part Chinese, etc. So you have to prove to yourself that you're Chinese ancestry. But come to think of it, I think a lot of us, whether we like it or not, have ties to China, and that we just simply forgot. But that does not necessarily, I mean, and of course, we have to establish that and respect that connection.
Mm,
But that doesn't always justify what's been going on right
yeah.
now, and I think that's what we have to figure out. And so we're definitely culturally connected and economically connected. But eventually, and right now, there's a bit of xenophobia and anger,
Mm,
particularly under the Duterte administration, wherein they more or less both kowtow
mm,
literally to Beijing, but and also do nothing to balance or to curb what China has been doing, whether it be through the South China Sea or West
Mm.
Philippine Sea, however you like to call it,
Yeah.
in that territorial dispute that
Mm.
has been, we won't discuss like in full here, but
Yeah.
it's just an issue,
Mm.
or even the influx of Chinese
Mm.
immigrants here. Like they just come in droves and there's no control over that.
Mm.
So in terms of like, so what can you say about this particular like political
Relationship.
maneuvering in relationship in the particularly in the age of the Belt and Road, where
Oh yeah,
it's a
regarding
charm
that.
offensive.
Yeah,
What
yeah, yeah.
and Duterte seems to be keen on jumping on that. So what do you think about that?
Okay, well, first and foremost, it is dysfunctional. It is a dysfunctional relationship because it is lopsided. We're not even part of the original plan for the maritime road.
Mm-hmm.
We're not part of it, and
Yeah.
our economic
Mm.
relation with China is not. It's not as rosy as many apologists would say, as far as
It's
data is concerned.
suboptimal.
Yeah,
Right.
as far as data is concerned, I linked it up. But according to Idris and Kamaruddin, they gathered data on China's outward FDI towards
Mm-hmm.
ASEAN countries from 2004 to 2012. The Philippines
Mm-hmm.
is not really a top recipient of FDI from China.
Mm.
Indonesia's getting more,
All
way
right.
more FDI from China, along with our neighbors. The Philippines is the lowest, one of the lowest,
Mm-hmm.
along with Malaysia to an extent, recipients of FDI
Right.
from China. And
Mm-hmm.
regarding trade, same from Idris and Kamaruddin, the Philippines is also, we are not the top trade partner of China among
Mm-hmm.
ASEAN countries as far as
Right.
2013 data is concerned. But
Mm-hmm.
politically speaking, I think this is the trick to understand China. China, as I've said earlier, is the great other right now. It's serving as the
Mm-hmm.
great other. So, but we must recognize the fact that China, to an extent, is similar to the Philippines, or we are similar to China before it became great.
Right.
China was impoverished. China was bullied by its neighbors. Well, let's say China during the Cold War. China was bullied by the Soviet Union. And
Mm-hmm.
again, China was poor, so on and so forth. But unlike the Philippines, China stood up against foreigners. And that's basically, I think that's one thing why China respects countries like Indonesia and Vietnam more.
Cause.
They, they can stand up against Beijing.
Uh-huh.
While
Mm-hmm.
well, Duterte likes
Kowtow.
them. Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
mhm. So I mean, there's a lot of interesting things you said there. Um, like, well, first, there's a lot we have in common, actually, like what you said.
Mm.
The and the thing is that I mean, there's and I think from there we can actually find a connection, like,
Mm.
and if we made the right choices, because in contrast to how Indonesia and Vietnam has responded, like what you said, that they're fighting back.
Mm.
For some reason, by Duterte's logic, you have to do what they say. Let Xi Jinping walk first in the time where Xi Jinping visited the Philippines.
Mm.
Uh, out like when he was outrunning him, outpacing him. My God! So according to Duterte, that probably might be a good way to get on his good side.
Mm.
But getting on his good side doesn't necessarily earn respect. So that's interesting. Um, the, but the thing is, I think despite all this bullying,
Mm.
even before Xi Jinping, even before Duterte, even
Mm.
before the South China Sea, I think ever since, in the Philippine consciousness,
Mm.
the Chinese has always been a symbol for strength and prosperity, and literally, it means old money.
Mm.
Besides, of course, the mestizos. Eventually, of course, if you look at the top 10 richest families or individuals, I think the only Filipino there is Manny Villar, but the
Mm.
rest are like Shuko, the Henry C's family, and of course the Spanish mestizo Ayala, but
Mm.
all the rest of the people in the list, etc. So it's
Mm.
like, and even during the 90s, especially, um, like there's a trend wherein the Chinese individuals who are not necessarily rich would be kidnapped and would
Mm.
be asked for like millions of dollars of ransom money. So which is like, yeah. So I think do you think there's a connection between this symbol of strength and right now and our perception of China now?
How can we balance? our approach to China.
Right.
How do you think? How can we balance?
You just answer my question with a question.
Okay.
Hmm, how do we balance? Well, the thing is, we have well, even if you wanted to like assert ourselves in the South China Sea, Scarborough Shoal, that general area, um, we don't have the resources or the strength for that, and
Mm.
we don't have the boats to
Mhm.
even, I mean, to even go there, patrol there regularly. Not even like forget navy. I mean, we don't even. I mean, we barely have fishing boats going in there. So that's why they bully us. So I
Mm.
think we have to establish that perhaps a partnership or shared, perhaps not equal, but a, what's the word I'm looking for?
Mm.
Equitable relationship,
Well,
however that may look like. So at the same time, they have the capacity
mm.
to harvest whatever or go there, but at the same time, we need to have a fair cut. I
Mm.
mean, that's where the stand, like fighting back or rising up, comes in.
Mm.
You know, do you think that's possible? Like just asking for a fair share because technically it's closer to us. You know,
Yeah, I
according to
think.
international law, we have
Yeah.
a better claim.
Mm.
You have the boats, you can harvest, but it's you need to give us a cut as well. That's the least we'll
Mm.
do. That's equitable. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, if we're going to interact with China, we must look at it from a business perspective.
Mm,
So, so yeah, that's one thing about China. China's been focusing more on establishing bilateral relations without any mediating institutions. We decided to go to the international courts, so that's something a bit off plan from the Chinese perspective. But if we are
mm-hmm,
to engage with the Chinese, with Beijing,
mm-hmm,
we must again need to show our strength. That's one
mm-hmm,
thing. We need to show our strength. Flex if we must. We can blow up boats that going into our waters the way Indonesia and
mm,
Vietnam does it.
mm,
But we need to do something similar to Vietnam and Indonesia. That's just, I think that's my answer. Simple as that. If we
mm-hmm.
are to
Right.
bargain,
Mm-hmm,
if we want to bargain, that's one thing. Do we even want to bargain? I think we do to an
mm.
extent, but is this government even willing
Capable.
to bargain? Do they want to bargain? I don't think they want to bargain. They just want to give the Chinese whatever they want. But
Mm-hmm,
for our case, so yeah, we just there are already examples. It is
mm-hmm.
quite stupid to say that it cannot be done because other countries are already
Right.
doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because come to think of it, a lot of like nationalist, people pushing back, like complaining to the kowtowing. What they're suggesting is like boycotting everything Chinese. But the thing is, like literally, I'd say close to 80 to 90% of everything we have is made in China, and not just made in China, but I think literally it's embedded in our culture, in our DNA. Like even in today, like you go into an SM, and you see that there's already Mandarin. Uh, every, like in Chinese New Year, like the Mandarin greetings, Ni Hao, Huaying Guaying, and there's also QR codes, which is originated in China. Literally, my God, WeChat can be used here. WeChat Pay can be used. Alipay can be used here. I mean, so yeah, I mean, economically, they're integrating with us. Culturally, like people still do feng shui. They have a statue of Buddha, even Guan Yu. People have, not just you, actually. You think you're weird. I've heard, my co-host right here has a statue of Guan Yu in his office, which is
Yep.
like a Chinese war god. But the thing is, he's not alone. Apparently, in Naia of all places, there's a huge statue of Guan Yu just right there, perhaps for good luck. So it's funny, it's in our consciousness, we're part of it. So why not, instead of fighting it just for that, why not simply just make it isolated? It's funny when we're mad at someone, like perhaps they made a mistake in a particular avenue, whether it be business, then we cut all ties to them. But why not settle business in the realm of business? Like, don't, how you say, get pissed at people, like at Chinese looking people they walk in the street, or if like boycotting everything made in China, that's not realistic. I think the best thing to do is, instead of like, how do you say, like being a bitter girlfriend and cutting everything off, uh perhaps like what you said, um stand up on your own 2 feet,
Yeah.
and assert yourself.
Yep.
But rather it's because it's much easier to um, simply do that than to, how you say, ignore everything that connects us with China.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do agree with that one. You know, regarding standing up to the Chinese, we can talk
Hmm.
about it at the level of high politics.
Hmm.
Manila standing up to Beijing, but you know, at the
Right.
everyday level, this is one thing. During one of my trips to Vietnam, there again, I went to Da Nang, really good place, really good city. Outside Ho Chi
Hmm.
Minh, it's a resort city, really nice. And again, Chinese tourists are there. They're making a ruckus in the beach, and you have a Vietnamese policeman shouting at them.
Yeah. Does that happen here? No.
No, it
Because
doesn't happen here.
mm-hmm.
So even at that level, Vietnam
Mm-hmm.
or the Vietnamese can assert themselves. Why not us?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. I mean, I mean, there are instances wherein the Chinese are, well, they have brushes against the law enforcement here, and there are some people who assert themselves. But on the other side, sometimes they're like, they even have their own Chinese help desk in the
Yeah,
police, and I think one of our mutual friends
yeah,
literally, she had a brush with China on the road,
yep.
the Chinese driver, and apparently they just let them go.
Hmm.
So if that's, I mean, if we'll double check that, but yeah, it's quite sad. It's inconsistent. There are some
Yes.
good cops out there that assert the Philippine law,
Hmm.
but the other times, perhaps because they don't want to speak Mandarin, or just
Now,
they can't
even
be
if
bothered.
Jesus Christ, the
Yeah.
Vietnamese is not using Mandarin to shout at the Chinese. He's using
Uh-huh.
Vietnamese, and he's just using body
Ah,
language.
there you go. Well, there you go. So, policemen out there, mga manong police, lumapag kayo para sa Pilipinas. Huwag ka na matakot sa inchik. So, yun. Anyway, for our international listeners, I just encouraged our
Policeman too.
people in blue. Yeah. Our our great policemen, So, yeah.
Yeah.
Any other ways to move forward with regards to, because right now, it's not exactly fashionable to
Mm,
be sympathetic to China.
mm.
You and I are actually forced into this middle position. We're
Yep.
Filipinos. We have lived in China, and literally our
We
our
studied in
degrees are on the
China.
line. We
Yep.
studied in
Right.
China, and our degrees are on the line. If no matter how mad we get at China, and believe me, you and I get mad at China a lot.
Yep.
We can't fully, like, how you say, be bitter girlfriend or boyfriend modus. At the same time, we have a responsibility to be like middlemen to make sure there's equitable relations between both
Mm,
countries in our own little way.
mm,
Like what we said, it's much more beneficial to
mm,
strengthen the connection that's already
mm.
there rather than cut everything off.
Yep.
So in this climate of anti-China sentiment,
Hmm.
what do you think we should do? Like, maybe perhaps even to our listeners, mga ka-PI natin, anong
No.
kailangan natin gawin
Yeah.
bilang Pilipino?
For our listeners. Well, the thing is, in practice, again, never let the Chinese or any mainland Chinese. Again, let's make a distinction. I think that's one thing that we need
Right.
to do. We must distinguish our Filipino Chinese brothers and
Mhm.
sisters from mainland Chinese. But
Right.
again, we must assert ourselves over them. But then again, it's usually
Mm-hmm.
at the hands of the law and law
Mm-hmm.
enforcers to do that. So I don't think we can do much about it. We can do
Mm-hmm.
our own little thing. If they cut in line and shout at them, Jesus, you know,
Mm-hmm.
why be afraid? Now,
Yeah.
I think another step that we can take, and this is
Mm-hmm.
something that may piss off people, and more or less I don't care.
Right.
I want to piss off people. We must
Uh-huh.
look at China as our model.
Ooh.
If China can do it, if China, a poverty stricken country, harassed by foreigners, having territorial
Mm-hmm.
disputes everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
manhandled by the Soviet Union until they
Mm-hmm.
break off relations and started
Right.
more or less one of the leading figures of the Third World Movement during the Cold War, the non-aligned movement. If China
Mm-hmm.
can do it, the Philippines can. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a change of mentality that we should have that
Mm.
I can't see. I just don't see it in many Filipinos. But then again, they're not that familiar with Chinese political history. So that's one
Right.
thing. So again, the great other is this mysterious other that you can either hate or love. China can be our
Mm-hmm.
model.
Right.
So change of mentality.
But here's one thing that, well, to an extent, I agree with that. But at the same time, China was able to do what it was able to do because it
Mm,
had certain things going for it, like its sheer population, its
mm,
cheap labor,
mm,
its how you say exceptional leadership. I mean,
mm.
don't get me wrong.
Yeah,
Deng Xiaoping was a reformer, but at the same time, he did how you say did some controversial
they're
things.
exceptional
I,
leaders, nevertheless.
yes, like they weren't perfect, they weren't saints
Yeah.
by no means. But we can learn from them. Literally,
Mm,
perhaps from the leaders like Deng Xiaoping.
mm.
Um, I think that's all I can say. Really,
No, the thing
I
is, regarding
yeah.
what you said a while ago, we also have natural resources. We have a good
Mm-hmm,
population. We don't have a large population, but we have a young one in comparison to
mm-hmm,
China right now, and China is preparing for a
mm.
demographic winter. So we
Well,
have these
that is
things.
true. Yeah, right.
So
No, but the same, yeah, but at the same time, we have to
mm,
calibrate it because we do
mm,
not have 1 billion people. We do not have cheap labor. We do not have what do you say? Similar kind of resources or systems uh,
well,
where we can copy. So at the same, we can do it step by step.
fair
Like for
enough.
instance, one thing yeah,
Yeah.
one thing that we do have in common with them is that we're oddly enough decentralized.
Mm.
So perhaps if we can strengthen local governance, we
They're
can
also
strengthen
decentralized
empower the mayors. And, I mean, yeah, that's the point. They are also decentralized.
in a
We,
bad
on the other
way.
hand, in a bad way. So I mean, for some reason, I mean, because there's a certain kind of competition within China
Mm,
that's more or less productive to their economy. Like it's
mm.
up, like they don't really establish hard laws or processes per se. They simply establish like quotas,
Yeah,
and as
Beijing.
long as you meet a quota to the Beijing or the central government, then you get how you say then they get merits and demerits depending on your performance. And that's one thing to keep Chinese party in line. They have a strong party system. My God,
They have
that's
a
one thing we kind of need in the Philippines.
strong and to an
It's
extent
a way of like
self-correcting.
establishing, yeah, self-correcting and controlling and
Mm,
party discipline. I mean, it's a bad word for a lot of China watchers out there, but it has its perks. It
mm.
ensures that there's not as much corruption and infighting. Of course, they haven't completely eliminated it, but that it's more or less kept to a predictable level.
Yeah,
Do you agree with that? So yeah.
predictable in the sense
So
that if you're corrupt, you must still you must still satisfy quotas.
oh yeah.
If not, you're
So
fucked. I think our
oh,
professor, yeah, regarding
mm-hmm,
corruption, just to increase the information that our listeners have, I think our professor did
right,
write a paper on it, and
right,
he said he more or less he studied local government leaders,
right.
and he found out that corruption levels in China only increase for public officials with no other options for promotion, meaning they're more corrupt when they're about to retire or when. So if you
Right.
uh, the younger officials or officials with better
Mm-hmm.
connections or those who can be promoted, they're less corrupt. They cannot afford
Right.
to be. While those who
Mm.
are, they're the ones who's just pocketing money for their retirement fund. So that's one
Right.
way. Whenever we talk about party discipline, it's not about all members following a single line. It's about
Mm-hmm.
each other, the system correcting itself or having mechanisms to correct its members.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
just one clarification.
Mm-hmm. Because it's funny, like at least they have a clear set of outcomes. They're guided by a set of incentives and disincentives.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're saying just follow this path, and then you'll be able to be promoted.
Yeah.
But if they have no options, yeah. But
Yeah.
that's one thing that the Philippines have. Like I think we said in this previous episode that the
Mm,
Philippines has a zero sum game, meaning
mm,
there you either win or you lose. There
yeah.
is no incentive for coalition building,
Mm.
or cooperation or partnerships. It's just I don't know, kampi-kampihan, like I don't know, like just
Coalition building in the
uh
Philippines, we have bandwagoning.
bandwagoning. It's not based on like economic benefits or like proper debating on policies. It's basically following the president, is what you're saying with the
Yeah.
bandwagon, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's no real debate. There's no real healthy competition. It's to the point where this pattern in local governments and even like I say national level,
mm,
that whatever policies that your predecessor had, they would eliminate it. I
mm.
mean, it happens in China, but at the same time, whatever works, they keep.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's one thing.
So instead,
Whatever
that's one thing.
works.
Pero sa Pilipinas, pag ginawa niyan sa if it's done by yung sa kalaban mo, papalitan, di ba? So yeah, that's the unfortunate thing about Philippine politics, and I think we need to learn that from China. But we
Hmm.
need to do what works. What's working for them, but without being their alleged as a whole self.
Let's just say
So
the
yeah.
Chinese are good at adapting practices. They're good at
Mhm. Right,
they're good at modifying things to suit their own conditions, and I think that is one thing
right.
that we can learn from the Chinese. Again, the Chinese will
Mhm.
not say follow us. Even
Mhm.
the Chinese would say we're not a model. So
Mhm.
my argument is against China's own disclaimer or Beijing's own disclaimer. We're
Mm.
not a model. You're not supposed to. We're not imposing our model on other countries, and you're right,
Mhm.
and they are right. They're not imposing our model, but we can
Mm.
learn from not only their mentality, but
Mhm.
from how they approach policy
Mhm.
problems and
Right.
probably some practices if it fits. If it fits, again, I think that's a disclaimer or a
Right.
qualifying statement that I would say. We try to emulate China if the practice fits, and it
Right.
will only fit, or we can only say that if it fits if we try it. That's one
Mhm.
thing.
Right. But before we try it, there's one more step that's crucial,
Hmm,
and I think this would, and I think that's to increase or incentivize and
hmm,
promote studying China.
hmm,
Because the thing is, how do you know what works and what
hmm,
doesn't work, or what can work and what won't work if we don't really study the Chinese experience? And although we are not a one-to-one comparison, there's a
hmm.
lot of differences between us.
Yep.
It's not impossible,
Hmm,
like what you said, like in the terms of like local government and party discipline there, and maybe even local
yeah.
democracy. Did you guys know that there are elections in China
Yeah.
and in the local level? So yeah, you
Gradually
didn't know that.
democratizing. That's one thing regarding
Hmm.
the notion of if it works, then use it. That also
Yeah.
guided Chinese democratization. So if people would say, "Yeah, China is not democratic," it had democratized at an experimental
Right.
sense, and this is
Hmm.
something new. So
Right.
their democratization is incremental.
Right. Actually, it almost became there was a huge democratic wave happening in 2009,
Hmm.
somewhat just before Xi Jinping arrived. Xi Jinping was actually a huge factor, and it kind of curbed that and controlled that. So yeah, that's an interesting pattern. But for a long time, like more and more people had a democratic sentiment. So
Yeah.
that's one thing that you should consider, and you would know that if you read more material on China. And I
Oh,
think
yeah.
that's one thing that you and I both might agree on.
Hmm.
Like we need to increase understanding, not just in the academic sense, like reading or
Hmm.
watching or in educating ourselves
Hmm.
about the Chinese experience, but also perhaps in dialogue,
Hmm.
talking to each other. Perhaps even debating.
Hmm.
On important issues,
Hmm.
properly debating, not just shouting nationalist epithets or
Hmm.
racism, etc. Simply just talking to one another. Even perhaps that'll be a clue or the key in
Yeah.
solving these international problems that we have. So yeah, you agree with that?
But again, yeah, it takes balls to talk because
Hmm.
it takes less effort to just nod your head and agree. That's
Right.
one thing that I think that's something that we have lost to an extent. It takes,
Hmm.
you know what? It takes balls to talk. It's easier to either nod and agree or just shake your head in disagreement. It is harder. It takes more effort. It takes more courage to talk to your enemies.
Right. Well, not
If
necessarily enemy, frenemy, or I don't know, uh,
or talk to
frustrated
others.
ally or
Uh,
others. There you go.
the thing is, if you talk to that great other is demystified, and that
Hmm.
great other loses a part of its power. That's
Right.
one thing. If you don't talk to China, if you either simply disagree forthright or
Hmm.
you just agree and nod your head,
Right.
the mystical power of the great other remains.
Ooh.
But if you start talking to it, if you start learning more about it, it gets demystified. You know its weaknesses. And that's one thing that we got from Shanghai. We knew the weaknesses of China's government.
Hmm.
China is as fragile
Be-
as it looks big right now.
hmm But again, a lot things work. We learned what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah.
So that's a thing that we benefited from our Chinese education. So yeah, I mean, a lot of people, akala ng mga tao, we betrayed the Philippines. Kapalit lang ng sprat list.
we are
Scholarship. Yeah.
we are tasked to demystify China, and that's something that we did. China is fragile right now in economic terms. It's undergoing structural change,
especially in the pandemic.
Yeah, and
right.
it has recovered. It has recovered, but it's facing a demographic winter on one hand, some structural changes. Several of its sectors are under threat because labor is moving to the services and away from agriculture and industry. It's politically speaking, we need to thank the Constitution for giving us the LGC, or we need to take the local government code for having that one, because China's central and local government relations are far more fucked up in comparison to ours.
And that's one thing else to consider. And I think it's what so yeah. And I suppose you and I can invite our listeners and everyone as much as possible to start studying China as a means, not necessarily to outright emulate 100%, blindly following them, but again, to carefully study and understand what might work and what doesn't work, and like what you said, it's not all it's not all a walk in the park for them either. They still have their problems, but they are still a world power nonetheless. And it's important to understand, and I think it's a good way to transition. We have a lot of discussion, but I think we can continue some other time. For now,
one last point before we move to recommendations. I think one last point.
Anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
One last point. I'll modify my first argument. I said that China can be our model. I'll modify it. We can be better than China.
Ooh, okay.
We can be better than China.
Big words.
We should strive to be better than China. But you can only be better if we understand the model first. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
So,
and speaking of studying and learning, now is the time for a special Chinese New Year recommendation. Yeah. Where we talk about possible supplementary materials that can help you understand our discussion, and push it forward. What do you have to recommend for us as a scholar and student of China?
I would like to recommend this ube flavored tikoy. Just kidding.
Okay. Also some jasmine tea. Anyway.
Tikoy.
Anyway.
I recommend the book How China's Leaders Think.
Ooh.
By
who?
Robert Kuhn. So it's an insider's perspective. Again, that's one thing. The great other. China is this great other. Again, read this book if you find it. I think there are some available on sale. I got mine from National Bookstore on sale for 99 pesos, which is it's a good book. Again, be careful about reading it because Robert Kuhn is an insider. He has insider's access to the Chinese elite. That's one thing.
Right.
So it's a curious perspective on how national resurgence, how their power, their sense of power, more or less, has shaped the way of thinking for many of Chinese elites. And this is an insider's perspective. This is not speculation. So yeah, I recommend that one if you do find it. That would be great.
Right. And I hope it'll be all right if I ask you perhaps one more recommendation, because I think one thing that's interesting that our listeners might be interested to know is that a board over here is actually interested in ancient Chinese knowledge, things like Confucius, Lao Tzu. So I was curious, like, if you can recommend something from an actual Chinese scholar.
Okay.
That you can act as a starting point for a lot of our listeners.
Okay. I'll recommend this plain flavored tikoy.
Okay. That's hilarious. Okay. Yeah.
Twice is okay. Twice is fine. Okay, but for starters, again, it's ordinary to simply recommend Confucius or Lao Tzu. They have their own merits. Fine, you can read them. You can read the Analects and Lao Tzu. But if you can find a copy of this, you can read the Xunzi.
Yeah.
Xunzi paved the way for the integration of legalistic and Confucian thinking, which more or less until now defines China's approach to justice, and legality. So yeah, so
Yeah.
the Xunzi is it's integral in understanding how China's government runs at the level of ideas. So what are the ideas running through their own policy making? So it's a combination of ruling through law and ruling through virtue. So that's
Hmm.
Xunzi's main argument.
Yeah. And I'm sure a lot of perhaps even law students might appreciate that, like how important the law is in governance.
But it
People
cannot
forget
stand,
that.
yeah, but it cannot stand
Yeah.
alone without virtue. So
Hmm.
rule of law and rule of virtue. So
Hmm.
one thing.
Interesting. It's actually a offshoot of Confucianism, am I right?
Yeah, it is a deviant case. It's
It's
a
a deviant.
deviant Confucian classic.
All right. That'll be interesting. I actually have my own copy. I haven't really read it yet, but yeah,
Mhm.
it's very good recommendation from both a contemporary and a classic
Yeah.
Chinese knowledge.
Mm.
For me, my recommendation is a bit more contemporary, and I have three
Mm.
in comparison. The first thing I want to recommend is a book by our own Philippine scholar, Carolyn Howe. Her book is The Chinese Question. And I think she it's a good beginner's outlook as to how the Chinese ethnicity or subgroup, you know, has embedded itself in contemporary culture. So it has a bit of a history, but more on contemporary culture, like how the fact that so we have a lot of contemporary shows like My Bidon the Girl
Mm.
and Manopo, the what eighth, ninth Manopo iteration. The fact that these uh, popular culture popular culture items are still resonate to this day
Mm.
shows the Chinese influence, and the fact that SM, which is originated by a Filipino Chinese businessman like
Mm.
Henry C, is a big part of our lives, is also worth studying and understanding. So yeah, a lot of what I've said actually came from that book, so
Mm.
perhaps you could check it out. The next one is actually a podcast, and one of what I consider as the model and inspiration for this podcast, the Sinica Podcast. It's hosted by Kaiser Guo and Jeremy, and they talk about a lot of things. And I think that book that you mentioned
Mm.
was actually discussed in one of their episodes.
Mm.
But it talked about all sorts of things like Chinese popular culture, international politics, China and Africa, China and Europe, all sorts. And they've been running for almost like about 5 to 6 years, and
Mm.
it's I still listen to it to this day, and it's one of the main sources on understanding China, both contemporary and classical China. They sometimes talk
Mm.
about classical works
Mm.
like The Red Mansion and uh,
Three
Romance of the Three
Kingdoms.
Kingdoms.
Yeah.
So I think I recommended to you this before personally, but yeah, feel free to check it out
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
well. It
Yeah.
is. I suppose if you notice what Kaiser does to Jeremy, I do to Borge. So yeah, literally, it's one of my models for podcasting. So shout out to Kaiser and Jeremy out there. I love you guys. And
And
and lastly, and one thing that is a bit well, this one is a bit more informal. It's very casual. It's actually a Chinese drama. It's not a romance. The Chinese drama. Now, most people talk about Korean dramas, and it's a form of like soft power, like teenage girls and their mothers are watching Korean dramas and they love it. So it's a form of like Korean soft power. China has been trying to replicate that for a long time,
mm.
but oddly enough, has had mixed results. Like, until I discovered in Netflix this fascinating show about esports. We talk about esports, talk about like League of Legends, we talk
Mm.
about online games, etc. And this one is called King's Avatar, and it is so good. It's basically
Mm.
about this ace player that is forced to retire and is now starting from the bottom. He's building up his new team to get revenge on his old team that kicked him out, and it is so good. It's literally about um, like they talk about strategy. It's as if they're spouting quotes from Confucius or like The Art of War by Sun, like, yeah, The Art of War. So it's smart, and it has like teenage tween drama. But that's actually minimal. There's barely any romance in it, but there's a hint of it. But the main highlight is esports, which is again it's big in Asia right now, and it's also so it's if you're into video games, kind of like me, like I got back into it. I don't consider myself as a gamer, but I eventually got back into it, especially Genshin Impact, which is again another Chinese influence.
Wait, that's Chinese?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, fair.
Fair enough. So yeah, that clearly we've been particularly excited about this episode, so I have a lot to recommend. But feel free to check at least one or two of them out. So yeah, but I've this week I've been stressed, but what helped my stress was watching that Chinese drama. I think I'll watch more, but so yeah, I'm hipster that way. More people are talking about Korean drama. I'm watching Chinese drama, bitches. All right. So yeah, that is our Chinese New Year special. So it's funny. This will be this is recorded on the eve of Chinese New Year, and it'll be released on the day after. So we're sandwiching Chinese New Year, so we can all eat our own tikoy at our own time.
Oh, damn it! I should get some.
You've been recommending that a lot, actually. That counts. You have 4 recommendations. Any last words on Chinese New Year?
Well, Chinese New Year. I think the year of the ox right now, right?
Yes. Hopefully everything will be okay.
Yeah, regarding K-pop or Korean culture and Chinese culture competing for soft power, in Shanghai, Korean mall, they have a Korea mall in Shanghai, but
in a Koreatown.
Yeah, they have a Koreatown and they have a Korea mall, but the Korea mall is underneath the People's Square.
Oh, right underneath the center of the city. My God.
Yep. So that's the symbolic.
Right.
Anyway,
so that's it for our Chinese New Year special. We'll be back with more of our content. We're in term break, so hopefully we'll create more content for you guys.
Yep.
So enjoy your tikoy, enjoy your dumplings, enjoy your chowking.
But you're not chowking yet. I'm gonna order this Saturday.
Oh yeah. Anyway, gong hei fa chai. Betchay. It's really late. All right. Happy Chinese New Year. Jinyan Kuaila. And until the next episode.
Magandang gabi, mga kapiay.